What was your nickname in college again? I remember you always used to eat the food off everybody's plate in the cafeteria, and we had a nickname for you. I can't remember. Was it like dustpan or lunchbox or something? I can't remember.
It was scraps.
Right. Because you ate the scraps off everybody's plate.
Yeah, because I had no money.
Yeah. I remember I bought you coffee every day for 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. By the way, you owe me about 142 coffees.
Sounds about right. Yeah. You said Lunchbox in there. Wasn't there a baseball player named Lunchbox or Lunchbox Hero or something like that?
Yeah, Lunchbox Hero. It was Travis Snider. He played for the Blue Jays.
Huh.
He's our guest today. Welcome to Second Story, everybody. I'm Josh Cybulski. With me, once again, it's Corey Leckie. What's up, Corey?
Hey, how's it going, Josh?
I never know whether or not you were with me on the last episode or not, because I've been trying to do episodes without you as much as possible. So it's good to see you today, though. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, no worries, man. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, there you go. I'm real excited for today's episode. Joining us today, we have Travis Snider. Travis played 8 seasons of Major League Baseball for Toronto Blue Jays, Pittsburgh Pirates, and the Baltimore Orioles. He's now the CEO of 3A Athletics, as well as a real estate investor. Travis, welcome to Second Story.
Thank you guys for having me.
I don't follow many baseball players on Twitter anymore. Actually, you're the only one that I still follow. I used to follow a ton of them back in the day, but their lifestyle started to make me feel bad because I was living with my mother at one point when I was like 27. But your Twitter was always food. It was always like pictures of steaks and stuff. I'm like, wow, I mean, I got to eat, so I'll follow this guy.
Yeah, I tried to keep the idea of Twitter when it started scared me quite a bit because I was a young guy, big city, had a pretty big following at that time as far as the fan base went, and things took off pretty quickly. But I tried to keep it centric around food and things that weren't just posting my workouts or talking about how much money I had and things like that. And I think I found a lot of enjoyment from that space, being able to stay away from some of the things that people really get engaged and maybe over stimulated by. So I enjoy keeping it light. And as I've gotten into the 3 athletic stuff, obviously we're going a little bit deeper and maybe pressing some buttons, but that's all with the greater purpose of trying to help kids, help parents, and help coaches.
Yeah. Twitter, I mean, it used to be real fun. It's kind of a cesspool, but it's kind of a fun cesspool at times too. As long as you don't take it too seriously, I think it can still be pretty light. So, you're still the only ball player that I follow. Might be the only athlete that I follow on Twitter at this point. So we are Second Story. We talk to people who have gone through a major change in their life, be it personal or professional. And I'm really excited to hear your second story today. So Travis, if you wouldn't mind sharing your second story with us.
16 years as a professional baseball player and 32 or 33 years of being the baseball player. I retired in 2021 and had to figure out who I was outside of that identity of being a baseball player. And for me, that is what kind of led to what I'm doing now at 3 Athletics, is helping educate parents, coaches, and players in the arena of youth sports to really break down what is the identity formation process and how are sports a great vehicle to teach kids life lessons and more about themselves and their self-development without putting the labels on kids like labels were put on me at a very young age. And that's something I've had to work very hard in a therapeutic space to really understand and get to the root causes of some of the issues that I've had, but also something that drives me every morning when I wake up, knowing that a parent or a child might be impacted in a positive way by what we're trying to do. And that's what gives me the juice.
Travis, I read in an interview that as a teenager, your mother passed away and some other people that were close to you. Do you think that you allowed yourself to grieve those, or did you use baseball as sort of a distraction through those things?
Yeah, I talk about baseball being a safe space, especially through mom was in a coma for 2 weeks my freshman year of high school, which at 14 years old was pretty scary. Sports had really taken off for me, and this identity of being a baseball and at the time varsity football player my freshman year was a big deal at our school. So there was all this kind of attention from the positive space of sports, but then all the negative things that I was dealing with off the field with my mom going through what she was going through. And I've spoken about it. Both my parents battled addiction throughout my childhood and into my adult years. and watched my mom and my dad. I think above all else, I got to see them really try to be a better version of themselves and face their demons head on, even though the attempts weren't always successful. That's a part of recovery for people who understand that world. And just as humans, right? None of us are perfect. But it was really eye-opening. But to your question, I think baseball was always that release for me. And then, as I talked about before, making that debut at 20 years old with the Blue Jays and kind of being the prospect and somebody who was supposed to be around the franchise for a long time, when I did finally struggle at the major league level and got sent down, it was like my whole identity was shattered and my ego got very triggered. And all the things that I had believed to be were kind of the safe, expected, you could kind of predict the future, what was going to happen. It was a quick life lesson for me to understand that no matter how good you think you are, what kind of plan you have in mind, the world and life has its own plan. And for us as humans to be able to go through those experiences, I did not grieve them, I would say, in the healthiest and to the depth of which I needed to. And there was a lot of things that led up to the death of my mom when I was 19 years old that I still needed to unpack. And those are the things that I've spent the last 20 plus years really trying to figure out the right resources and build that team of advisors around me so that I can have help, right? Which is a tough thing to do as a young man when you feel like you have a lot of things figured out and hadn't really struggled on the field at that point. There's definitely a correlation to the experiences I had off the field that were now taking place on the field. And it started to trigger this, what I've been diagnosed with is complex PTSD, which I didn't even know that was a thing. I thought that, like most people, PTSD, you go to war. So getting that diagnosis after I was done playing, really engaged in my own one-on-one therapeutic process, as well as marriage counseling with my wife, which I still do both, was a really eye-opening experience for me. How much of these things had stemmed from childhood experiences. And again, it's really the motivation behind 3A athletics.
Okay.
That was going to be my question, is how much your upbringing and everything you went through as a young man, how much did that play into your post playing career and what you've moved into professionally?
Yeah, I mean, we had our third child in Gwinnett, Georgia. I was playing AAA for the Braves. We had two young boys, and we had a great experience, and we wanted that experience for our kids to be able to go to the ballpark, see daddy play baseball, all the good stuff that comes with that. But there's just a lot of stress, right, as a family when you're living in a different state and you're having your third child. Thank God my mother-in-law is a saint, and she was there by our side through all of that, right? But not having my mom going through that process was obviously very difficult, and having limited help now that my father's passed away as well, it creates those challenges within parenting, which is already really hard. So as I was entering the space of retiring from baseball and starting to coach my kids in youth sports, that's why I really started to see not only what my friends who had played and gone through the identity crisis of being a good athlete or being good at something, school, going on to a career, and really putting everything as far as self-love and your own self-value and what your identity is based off of what you do versus who you are, right? And that was a big question I had to unpack. I'm no longer the baseball player. Obviously, I could get a job and go coach and just stay in the game of baseball, but I felt like for me to actually reach the point where I could lead not only the young kids that I teach, but eventually when I do get back into coaching, I want to be able to lead from the front and lead by example and be able to talk about these things and be vulnerable with people so that they understand no matter how much success you have, there's always going to be struggles along the way. And preparing yourself for those struggles is difficult when you can't see what's ahead of you, but it's something we as human beings, we have to develop those skills to be able to process it in a healthy way, which I have done a lot of unhealthy processing of my emotions and not knowing how to regulate emotions, right? When it comes to whether it's your performance on the field or your marriage or the way you parent your kids, there's a lot of things that stem from past experiences that we're just not aware of. And I think that was a big light bulb that went on for me that has motivated us to get into this space of youth sports and really open parents' eyes to what their kids are experiencing and have them draw on their past experiences so that they understand some of the good and some of the bad that you go through with your parents is going to affect you, right? And if we don't actually process those things and understand them and choose to break some of the cycles that are in place, it's going to put us in a spot where we're reacting from a subconscious place, right? And doing things that aren't aligned with our values. And I think that was a big thing for me at the end of my career. I just wanted to be a better husband. I want to be a better father. I want to be more present, right? And emotionally get better because I know with what I've dealt with, there's easy excuses to act certain ways and make mistakes, but I didn't want that built-in excuse, and I didn't want to keep passing those cycles on to my kids.
When you talk about yourself when you were in sports as a youth, can you look back and think of some like pressure moments that you had? Like, is there anything that you can recall from that time?
Yeah, I talked about it in the New York Times article. I had two panic attacks, and when I was 9 years old, made the All-Star team with a group of my friends, and we ended up winning the Washington State Little League Championship for 9 and 10-year-olds, right? Which was a big deal for a Little League that had never really gone beyond the district tournament. And we realized we had a group of kids and a group of dads and parents that really loved the game of baseball. And as we went through our 10-year-old year, we took second in state, right? So we were very close to repeating. And then at 11, if you win state, you get to go on to the Western Regionals, which is now, I think, the Northwest, right? So we get to fly on an airplane at 11 years old, all good stuff, right? We get to go to Disneyland while we're down there. But the pressure of walking into that tournament, for me, I didn't understand like what was kind of boiling beneath the surface for me. And I had thrown a no-hitter and hit 2 home runs in the state semifinal game. And I think we 10-run the team to win the state championship. And here we are going down to San Bernardino, California, thinking, hey, we're going to go down here and compete. And we got humbled. But for me personally, I had a really good first inning, hit a leadoff homer, and then struck out the side and went back out to pitch the second inning and just couldn't throw a strike, right? And I started creating all the excuses, the umpire, this, that, whatever. Finally, they had to take me out of the game. And for me to process my emotions, I wasn't able to do it in that moment. And I didn't understand it at the time. We thought it was sports-induced asthma and obviously an emotional reaction. But like looking back on it, it was a panic attack. And that's something happened that the second game that I was going into pitch in similar situation just triggered that kind of the yips type of feeling. And it was something that, again, I just kind of shoved down and moved forward and went on and had, success from 12 to 18 and never really had those types of moments later in my career to where I could see the pattern. But when I was going back through those past experiences and really trying to understand, that one really stuck out at me, where it was one time where I really did kind of struggle in the league, and it only happened in 2 games. And despite us, we took 7th out of 14th, and then we lost in the state championship the next year. So we didn't get to advance and go to that same tournament. It was a really difficult experience for an 11-year-old kid, right? Not understanding what's actually taking place and the amount of pressure I was putting on myself, the amount of pressure I felt from the external expectations. You start reading articles about yourself at that age and seeing your stats and just understanding you're pretty good at a sport, but it's like that confusion at that stage where you're getting really good at a sport. Is that what makes me valuable? Or is it me, the work ethic, the type of teammate, all the things that kind of get overlooked with the early success?
Obviously, that's a pretty traumatic experience as a kid, having panic attacks at a young age. Did anything like that happen as you got into the majors? Like, you made your professional career at Yankee Stadium, which is about as pressure packed as it could be. I remember it vividly. 08, late August. I remember living in Vancouver and watching it with my roommates at the time and thinking, like, what a place to make your major league debut. What was that like? Did you ever experience anything like that in the majors?
In that weekend, no. I think I was just a culmination of years of hard work, and we went through a pretty storied senior year of high school. We went 27-0, won the state championship with basically the same core group of guys from those little league teams I was talking about before. And a lot of us had played together for 12, 15 years at that point, right? So it was really special going through that, having all the scouts there, still going out on the field as a team, performing and accomplishing our goal, and then being a first-round pick, right? And I go to Pulaski, Virginia. I went 0 for 4, I think, with 3 strikeouts the first game there, and then just took off. And I never really felt like, oh, I don't belong here. So I kind of skipped that part of the development where you really kind of get punched in the mouth by the game. You got to reevaluate and move forward. So kind of flying through the system after that was a great experience, but I get asked the question all the time, do you think you're ready? And I think on some levels, yes, I was ready. I was ready to go and play. I wasn't ready to go and fail. And that was something that first weekend I got to fly out. 3 of my best friends, my sister and my dad, all flew out to New York City, got to watch me play my first game. And we spent the weekend in New York, right? We're going out for steaks, and it was like the dream came true. And part of what I've learned throughout this process with success and failure, right, is you have these expectations, you meet the expectations of getting to the major leagues. Like I had told my agent before the season, I'm going to be in the show at the end of the year. And he's looking at me like, wow, you're pretty convicted. I'm like, I'm going to make it happen. Because a couple of guys, Justin Upton, Cameron Maben, they had done it the year before. So going into that year, I was heavily motivated by accomplishing that goal. I've told the story where the Jays told me I wasn't going to go up like 3 days before. They called me up. They said, yeah, we're going to keep you in AAA. You're going to go back to the Arizona Fall League. And I was good with it. I mean, obviously a little disappointed, but it didn't affect me on really any level. And then 3 days later, I get that call. So it all kind of happened really fast. That weekend was a blast. I ended up playing really well for the month of September, right, and kind of put myself on the map going into 2009. I had a great spring training down there. I didn't feel any pressure, even though as I started to have some success, you start to get more of the hype. And I didn't have the hype like the prospects do now, but it was still a lot for me at the time to really understand and process it. And then going into the 2009 season, I had a great first 3.5 weeks and hit a couple home runs in the old Metrodome in Minnesota, and was having a lot of success at the plate. But then it hit kind of a patch where I was late on fastballs, and there's some conversations taking place amongst the coaching staff and myself that started to trigger this idea that maybe I didn't have it all figured out, right? And as coaches, we're really trying to do the right thing, Cito and the rest of that staff. We just kind of clashed in terms of where I was at in my process and what I felt like I needed to do, and the way that they were trying to coach me. Just we didn't mesh very well once I started to struggle, and they wanted to kind of help. And I think that was, again, part of my own ego that wanted to say, no, I have this figured out and I'm going to do it despite you guys. Looking back on it, right, and I've had a chance to hug Cito and kind of laugh about those experiences and some of the other coaches that were there just witnessing. I didn't realize like how triggered I would get, right? And that's a word that's tough for some people to process. But I mean, I would sometimes I wouldn't say anything, or I wouldn't actually go and like verbalize my emotions, but you could tell my cheeks would get red, or usually a good indicator I'm embarrassed or angry about something. And I joke with the AAA hitting coach who I used to go down and work with when I get sent down, and we get all these things figured out, and then I go back up to the big leagues and have success early on. And there's just the consistency aspect, right, is where I really struggled. And after that first time of getting sent down, this is where it kind of ties into that complex PTSD. You feel like you have no control over anything, right? Which is a difficult thing, but a real world problem, right? Everybody has to experience that, especially in the world of working for other people and running your own business. So it was something that I wasn't prepared for, that moment, or of getting sent down, and then how to process that with the understanding I'm still 21. I went down there, I got hurt. I ended up being out for about a month and a half, came back, was killing it in AAA, calling my agent, when am I getting called up? All the things that I watched young guys do later in my career, and I try to help guide them through it. It was like, hey, this is completely out of your control. So I really wanted to be in control of everything, which is not how professional sports work. And had these expectations that were not being met by my own expectations in the external. And I talked about it a lot that, at that time, social media wasn't really prevalent yet. I hadn't gotten on Twitter until I think 2010. But it was really easy to Google yourself. And that's a terrible habit for anybody who has success in something, is you start to read all these nice things that people are saying to you in Baseball America and all the beat writers and the national coverage that I was getting up in Toronto, and just not understanding that the more that you allow that kind of input into your system, the further away you get from your own values. And what makes you great at something is what you put into it, not what everybody tells you you're good at. You know what I mean? So I started really relying on external validation for the first time in my career, and that was a scary thing for me. And that was something that, as I was rebuilding my swing 10 times throughout my career, I'd lost every time. It was kind of a little chink in that armor where I didn't have that internal confidence and conviction that what I was doing was something that I could sustain without somebody saying, hey, you're doing it right. And leading up to that point of getting sent down, I took a lot of pride in never really having a one-on-one hitting coach. My parents couldn't afford it, but I also just was a sponge for information of reading books when I was a kid, watching video, and having other guys go and hit with hitting coaches. I'd get to pick and kind of feel out what I felt like was most beneficial for me in my swing. But as I got into professional baseball, I hit the whole time. So it wasn't, other than a little stretch in AA where we had a great hitting coach, it kind of helped me develop a routine, I think was the big hurdle for me to get over. I was pretty, I don't want to use the term self-made, but I just didn't rely on the outside information. And then once I got sent down a couple of times and was rebuilding the swing and trying to appease the front office with my statistics or whatever it was, instead of just focus on the process and go out and compete, it got very complicated for me just to be able to go play the game and enjoy playing the game the way I did when I was a kid and coming through the system.
Yeah, outside validation, you start looking for it. It certainly gets dangerous. Corey and I've had that conversation just about this show in general, like making this show, and we mostly make it for ourselves and to be fun.
Yeah.
But we've had talks of like when other people compliment us, we're like, oh, that's cool. But we've also had people insult the show too. And we realized like we're not a very big show, but we've had to kind of block out the noise. And I couldn't imagine doing it in an environment as pressure packed as professional sports. It's got to be just incredible to try to do
Well,
that.
and as social media has evolved over the years, there's just so much more access to other people's opinions that I think about what our parents went through growing up. They had a newspaper, they had the news, they didn't have the internet. So it's like everything's evolved to where the inputs are just so much greater than they ever were. And I think that's always my cautionary tale to young athletes and young humans, right? Is when you're having success, it's very easy to open Twitter. It's very easy to open Instagram and see all the likes and see all the comments. But as you guys have experienced, as you start to have any sort of success or you start to build something, there's always going to be criticism. And I think there's a lot of good ways to look at it. Oftentimes, the people that are criticizing you are people you would never take advice from anyway. So why is their opinion hold any value with you? But we're also human beings, right? So the more that you're exposing yourself to that stuff, without that foundation of understanding what it is that makes your guys' show great or what it is that makes me great as a player, understanding that we can only control what we can control, right? And if that's sitting there reading all the comments for anything other than like helpful feedback, because there's always going to be times for us to grow and evolve as humans, as business owners, as podcasters, but it's the emotional attachment, right? And I think that ties into what we're really trying to lean into for 3 Athletics is getting sports parents to understand where their emotional attachments lie, because it's the thing you love the most, running out there on the field, playing a sport, and you have no control over the outcome. The instinct is to want to coach your kids either from the behind home plate or the stands and yell at this and yell at that. And then you get in the car and you want to correct your kid on the mistakes that they made without realizing what that's really doing, right? Setting up your kid for failure down the road and not really understanding they need a parent first, right? And that's something I try and just hammer home with every parent that I talk to is understand that your kid doesn't need you to coach them all the time. They need you to be mom or dad. They need to feel safe and they need to feel loved. And when they're ready, they're going to come to you for that advice. And I think that's, as a parent, I've struggled with that. And that's what really drew me into working with Seth and eventually building this company around the parent guide book that he had written was like, how can we get parents to become more self-aware, give them some tools and exercises within this book to actually be able to understand what you bring into that relationship and how that affects the way that you talk to your kids, how that affects the way you think about them putting in work, right? Like, how are we going to get our kids to practice? Well, how much of a time does it feel like playing a game versus working? And that's a simple concept that in professional sports, we get paid to do it, right? So at some point it becomes a job, but you watch guys that struggle when they're at that high level because it now just the business stuff, whether it's, what the team said about you in an arbitration case or, they sent you down even though you had decent numbers compared to this, that, whatever. They have a plan, right? And I always tell people, whether it was JP Ricciardi, Alex Anthopoulos, Neil Huntington, or Dan Duquette. I mean, those are the 4 GMs that I played for in my career. They got a job, they got a family, they got decisions that they have to make that they feel like are in the best interest of the organization. And going from a super prospect who had all the opportunities, earned a lot of them, but had all these opportunities to then the end of my career, I talk about my career as like what I went through in the middle and the end of my career is what prepared me for life, right? Because if I would have just been successful and made hundreds of millions of dollars and never really struggled and never really had to look in the mirror and like do the deeper work that I've been doing, it's going to be a continual process for the rest of my life. That's just me as a person who believes in continual learning and self-growth. But it became very apparent that I had planted that flag. And that's what I was alluding to earlier. When you have that success and achieve a goal, you feel like, okay, I made it, right? And I remember I don't remember what alumni it was, but he was hanging out behind home plate. He goes, yep, it's easy to make it here. It's harder to stay. And that stuck with me. It was great advice, but it also kind of triggered me as I started going through this. I'm like, man, he's really right. Like, you get here, you feel like you can go and perform. I felt like I could hit in the middle of the order and hit 25, 30 home runs and drive in 100 runs because I had done that at every level, right? But then the emotional pressure and just all the things that I was experiencing became my emotional attachment to that success became too great. My ego had latched onto this idea that I was going to be like the Derek Jeter of the Toronto Blue Jays. At one point, that was my thought, right? I want to retire in Toronto. I want to be the organizational guy. I had a great relationship with Paul Beeston back then, and Paul was always very, very positive with me and like trying to encourage me to push through these things and just go out there and play. And then they're going to pay me, they're going to take care of me, all these things. But it just didn't work out the way I think everybody that was involved with that situation expected. But like I said, it led to much deeper experiences for me in my career. It taught me really how to push through things like playing independent baseball, which was something, if you would ask me in my early 20s, I would have said, you're crazy. I'll go home before I go play indie ball. But you get humbled, right? And that's what life and business and everything that we go through, we think we got to figure it out. And as soon as we think we got to figure it out, it punches you in the mouth. And that's why I love golf, right? Because I go out and play golf all the time. And I think, I'm putting in work here. We're at an indoor facility as we're recording this process, where I'm going to go work on my golf swing a little bit later on. But it's like understanding that you can only control what you can control, and refining that process and being able to self-evaluate and grow from those experiences is really what life's about.
As I'm listening to you, I'm reminded, this is going to seem like a weird quote to pull on, but Brad Pitt, I remember watching an interview with him where he talked about how he didn't become a movie star until he was in his 30s. And he said it was something that was necessary for him, because if it had happened 10 years earlier, he would have been so unprepared for it and just so immature. But the fact that he got humbled through his 20s and kind of beat up by life just allowed him to become famous at that point in time. I wonder with you, like, you obviously made it to the major leagues at such a young age. Like, 20 in baseball is very, very young to make it to the majors. A lot of guys, they're, mid to late 20s when they make it. How do you think your path would have been different if you had made it maybe when you were closer to 25 or 30 even? Like, would it have been much different, or do you think it would have been somewhat similar?
I think it's tough to speculate, but I think what you mentioned about Brad Pitt's quote is it resonates with me, because he had to grind, right, for the first 10 years, 15 years, whatever it was, for him to become successful. And that really gave him that foundation of understanding of like what I have to be able to be in control of and what I can't control. I think being young, I had been labeled as like beyond my years, maturity wise. I was a plus makeup guy. Every scout thought I was, as good of a makeup guy as you could have coming out of high school baseball. That's why I was a first round pick, and the Blue Jays took that shot on me. But having that reputation, and this happens with super prospects sometimes, is organizations, and I think the Jays did the best that they could, right, to support me through that process, but they don't really know how to put the bumpers up, right, for a young guy who's kind of shown that they have it figured out on the field, even though off the field I was no church mouse by any stretch of the imagination. I had my own issues, right, through my early years that they were aware of and very supportive, and got me the resources and work with their EAP program to really try and process all the things that I was going through and what it was leading to, some self-destructive behavior. But ultimately, it's a tough position to be in as a coaching staff, as a front office, to really know how to handle those situations. When you have this thought and belief that somebody is well beyond their years and is prepared. I remember JP Ricciardi, his quote when I got called up is, baptism by fire. And that was something that I embraced, right? And I'm getting chills talking about it, because I love the idea of having to grind through something that's going to be difficult. But again, not having really failed that much in baseball up until that point, different than Brad Pitt having to fail and kind of eat the dirt on the way up, climbing the ladder, didn't prepare me for that moment when I got sent down. And that's where, again, all the success and all the egotistical thoughts that I had started to really subscribe to got me away from those principles of what made me a first round pick, what made me a great player in my career. And it was something that I just struggled and battled with for the rest of my, at that point, another 10 years of just riding that roller coaster.
So you mentioned earlier that it was hard for you to find yourself, that you kind of identified just as a baseball player. And what things have you done to get yourself there, to find yourself?
So I've worked with my partner, Seth Taylor. He's a therapeutic life coach. I'd worked with the AP program. I'd work with, sports psychologists. I'd work with the mental conditioning coaches. And it's been fun to watch baseball evolve in that space, right? Because there wasn't a lot of that when I started in the major league level. And there's kind of a stigma around it. And I just said, you know what, I need this, so I'm going to do it. But I think what I've learned through all those experiences, I've gained a ton of really good skills. And we talk about mental skills, an important part of every human being's like evolution and development. But getting to the root cause of things, whether it's a physical ailment, a medical ailment, or a mental ailment, it's very easy to find ways to mitigate what you're dealing with as far as symptoms go. But not being able to get to the root, not being able to really process and grieve the traumatic, for lack of a better term, experiences that you have. Because again, we can use the word trauma and that might trigger some people, but if we think about it as just positive and negative experiences, those impact, right, the way that we function in our lives and how we go about things in our career. So it was difficult for me at that time not to be able to separate the idea of this work ethic, the characteristics that I brought to the table as a teammate, as all these other things. I had to really grind through that as a player and find ways to evolve as a leader and be a good clubhouse guy and be a part of a couple of playoff teams in Pittsburgh where I played various roles from the last guy on the bench to the opening day starter and starting the wild card game in 2014. It was just like a constant up and down thing as far as performance went. But again, all those experiences were just part of my process of humbling me to where at the end of my career, when I started working with Seth and we started diving deeper into those childhood experiences and some of the other experiences I had throughout my career, really started to open my eyes as to where I had kind of missed the opportunity to get to those things and really process them and hopefully be able to move forward. And that was always my thing. It was like 2019, I was very close to getting called up with the Diamondbacks. 2017, I was very close to getting called up with the Mets. 2018, I played indie ball, right? And I thought, okay, I'm done. I had retired. My brother-in-law was sick with melanoma, and he eventually passed away that offseason. So I had gone home at the end of the season to be with him. And again, another traumatic experience of losing somebody who was my sister's husband and the father of my, at the time, 2-year-old nephew. So again, these are all difficult off-the-field things that I was dealing with. But having Seth there at the end of my career with all the time, energy, and money that I had invested into the self-development, whether it's reading self-help books or working with these great sports psychologists and the support staff that we had in the organization, I had a good foundation and understanding, but I wasn't able to get to the root. And that's where Seth really helped me dive into it. And again, this is going to be a lifelong journey for me. I'm not standing here like I'm fixed, I'm perfect, any of these kinds of things. I just have a different perspective, right, on how we all function as human beings. And if we're functioning from a place of trauma, which is very obvious to me now in certain situations when I'm around my people or I'm doing my own self-evaluation stuff, where it's like, okay, I have to understand when those moments where I can't get out of my own way and I can't seem to solve the problem, even though I'm designed to like really process things and do that. How do you get back to that place where you get that release? And I think that everybody has their own process when it comes to therapy. And some people just get scared of the word therapy, which I completely understand. But what I've learned is through vulnerability, right? I've gained so much more strength, and it's not the external support that I'm looking for, but it's also, there is some validation in being able to share those stories and then have people reach out and say, hey, I went through something, maybe not exactly the same, but something similar. And I've always questioned, is something wrong with me, where it's like, no, you're just a human being, right? And these past experiences are affecting the present moment, which, again, there's tons of mental skills that will teach you how to meditate and teach you how to bring yourself to your breath, and all great skills I think everybody should try and learn at some point if you need them. But I had to dive deeper, and that's something where I'll get those reminders every couple of months if I'm not doing my work. It shows up in the way that I talk to my wife. It shows up in the way that I talk to my kids. And again, as somebody who's trying to lead by example, I know I'll never be perfect, so I don't want to put the pressure on myself to be like that. But I also want to continue to do that work so that I can model the behavior I'm hoping to teach my children.
For us in this show, a lot of the people that we've talked to, they've gone through certain traumas in life, and it's really been a defining moment for them. And that's sort of where Second Story comes from. Like my own was my father passing away, or at least it was one of the big moments in my life. And with trauma, it's always interesting to see how people react to trauma. For some people, it does become defining, and they go down a different path that ultimately ends up being a good path. And then for others, it obviously goes the other way and they end up going down sort of a destructive path. You mentioned that during your time in Toronto, you had sort of some self-destructive behavior. Did you ever see a moment where that was going to be like a long-term thing? Or do you think it could have been for you? And if so, like what changed and what allowed you to sort of get on this right path?
I think it's a tough balance for humans, but we'll just use professional athletes because that is my space, right? And when you have success and you're walking around a city like Toronto, where it's such a cool cultural experience, and I love the city, but it's a big city, right? And I'm not used to being recognized by people. Now I am, but not so much as I'm retired and out of baseball. But there was a period in time where walking around Toronto was like, it was kind of an awkward experience, when people are recognizing you. Now with that comes free dinners, comes, backstage passes. Like there's a lot of things that you can get from that experience, but it's tough to find that balance when you're starting to kind of sell your soul for that external validation. And I think during my career, especially as a young guy, being single in that city, I spent more time out than I probably should have. But part of us was like, well, we need this to blow off steam. This is what is, for us is a fun time outside of the world of playing sports. again, going through that experience in Toronto with all the media coverage, I never really got into real trouble in the city. I mean, I made plenty of mistakes that never really made it to the media. Drank quite a bit throughout my career, and had success doing it, right? Especially at the minor league level. So you're thinking, oh, I can do this at the big league level. But the amount of pressure on top of just better players starts to really chip away at this idea that you can just get by with doing. And I worked hard, I think, throughout my entire career. I didn't just skip days because I would go out party or whatever it was. But like I was looking for that love that I wasn't receiving on the field, and I wasn't receiving outside of the field because so much had been tied to what my stat lines were. And again, when you're having success, it's easy to walk around the city. It's easy to be the guy that is on Twitter and getting free meals every city we're going to and posting what looks like the perfect life. But behind the scenes, we're struggling. Most guys at major league level are struggling with something. That doesn't mean they all have complex PTSD or that they're not going to be able to overcome those things like I struggled to. But I think understanding that pressure and how that leads to decisions that consciously or subconsciously can be self-sabotaging because you don't really believe that path that you're on is you're worth it, right? And I think as you start to get chipped or punched in the face, it's harder for you to really keep that perspective of what makes you a great person. And that's where, having been through that experience in Toronto, took a little bit different approach in Pittsburgh. My wife and I had started dating, and we were official and getting married and having kids like throughout the next 6 years of my career, which brings in a whole new pressure, right? When you have kids coming into the picture. And at that time, the uncertainty in my career, I was on my first minor league deal with the Kansas City Royals, and my wife found out that she was pregnant with our first child. And I remember how scared I was, right? Because at that time, I didn't really understand finances. I didn't really understand what the career path was going to look like for me. And now I'm a minor league invite instead of being a big league invite like I had been for the last, I think, 10 years. So again, these are all things that the ego wrestles with. And for me, it was a scary time not knowing what my opportunity was going to be like in Kansas City, which again, I had a great opportunity there. I just didn't take advantage of it. And I talked about this in that 2016 season in Omaha. I had a great coaching staff, great teammates, but I really struggled. The first 2 weeks I crushed and thought I was getting called up. And then when the call didn't come, I just started to do, things where my attitude became not what it needed to be for me to be successful at that next level and get to that next level. So I started to really struggle. I started to overthink, overanalyze. At that time, I was taking 350 swings a day in the cage before the game, right? And having all this great work, and then it just wouldn't replicate into the game. And it was like such a tough thing for my ego to struggle with because I had never really failed in AAA at that point, and I sucked. I sucked that year. And the coaches watched me try and grind through it, and finally I got released in July. I didn't get picked up that year, so I was home early. Kind of going through this process of like, okay, we're going to give this another run. What are we going to do differently? So again, it led into 2017 where I was with a couple other former major league guys, and we kind of made a deal. Like anytime we complain about the 3 a.m. bus for the 6 a.m. flight that connects through Dallas to go to Vegas or wherever we were flying to, that AAA lifestyle is so much different than the major league lifestyle. And that's why you see a lot of guys who get to the big leagues, go back to AAA, and they never make it back because it's just constantly making excuses and pointing out all the things that suck about being a AAA baseball player, where if you're in the major leagues, you're flying private, you got all these amenities that are available to you. And some of the AAA stadiums, they've gotten a lot better over the last 10, 15 years, but it definitely was not a sexy experience, especially those first handful of years playing in Cashman Field at Las Vegas, where it's 110 degrees out and you're in the cage that's outside with no air conditioning. And again, I have some of my best memories of grinding through those things, putting in the work, right? And I feel like even in my time in Vegas, I was probably more well-behaved than I was in Toronto just because it was a different experience. But then getting traded to Pittsburgh and kind of going through that process I was explaining, you get into the AAA levels where I spent more than half of my career, and I developed some of the best relationships. I have some of my favorite experiences and memories and relationships with guys, but it's also constantly having to wake up and remind yourself that if you want to get back to where you want to go, you can't buy into the excuses that you can make all day in AAA. So again, this was part of that process for me that led me to the space where I'm like, okay, I know there's a lot more underneath the surface that I need to start leaning into, because just being a baseball player and thinking if I get back to the big leagues, it's all going to go away. And that's not the case, right? And eventually I didn't get back there. 2019, got hurt at the end of the season. Wasn't an official call-up, but was on the bubble, and then got invited back to Major League Camp in 2020. And it was a crazy experience, man, because my ego got really triggered. I had a really good spring training the year before as a minor league invite, no big league camp. And I just said, I'm going to go against all odds. And I did it. I ended up in AAA. I hit 400 the first month. And even my agent was calling me. He's like, dude, what are you doing? Like, what's going on? I'm just like, I'm locked into the process. There's no outside noise. But it was really hard for me to sustain that, right? Especially you start getting closer to reaching that goal. And then like the deeper underlying fears start to come in, like, well, are you really ready for this? Are you going to struggle with the same thoughts and anxiety and all the things that I experienced prior to that? So 2020, I struggled in spring. COVID hit. I got released. I got picked up by the Marlins, went to their alt site for 3.5, 4 weeks. Didn't play well enough to get called up, got released, and then went into the offseason in 2020 thinking I'm done. Alex Anthopoulos called and wanted me to come to AAA, which was the alt side at the time, and then ended up starting the year in AAA. And they gave me all year to play there, even though I was playing really bad, and supported me through the process. And I finally called Alex like a week or two before the season. I said, I'm done. Like, I just don't have the dog's got no more fight. I got no, like, I don't have the self accountability. The work I'm putting in is half-assed at this point. I just didn't have the drive. And at that point, I realized it's time to go home. It's time to face some demons. It's time to start putting in the work and be, like I said, a better husband, a better father, and just try and show up for my kids every day.
Yeah, that's got to be something at the tail end of your career. I know a few guys who have retired from hockey, and one of them played 21 years all around the world, professional hockey. Was only in the NHL for a short period of time, kind of like the story you're telling. He ended up getting sent back to the AHL, never made it back to the NHL, and it was certainly humbling. But it was something where, like, from what I've heard, had a couple years where just everything was miserable because he wasn't in the NHL anymore. It took him quite a while but he took that experience being humbled and traveled the world playing hockey. And he's now a coach, which is pretty cool. He's kind of moved into, he coaches a team, but similar space to you. Can we talk about your trade to Pittsburgh?
Yeah.
Because that's actually one of the memories I have from your playing career. It's probably the most vivid.
Well, it's crazy. I was, this was 2012. So I would have been, I was 23 or 24. But it was
in Seattle too, right?
Yeah, in Seattle. Yeah. We're playing against the Mariners, which was always a funny thing. I found a way to get sent down almost every year before we went to Seattle because I think part of it was a subconscious pressure of like, I'm going home to play in front of everybody. And like on a deeper level, I felt like a failure, right? When things didn't work out and I was back in AAA and I'm sitting there, I'm like, do my friends still care about my career, all the external validation, right, that I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. I didn't feel like I was that valuable anymore. And it was like a constant, even when I was in indie ball and I still had 7-8 guys checking the stats, my boys back home, like, oh, okay, this is not just what I do for a living. People actually like me other than that. And going through the trade process, it was a well-documented up and down career with Toronto. That year I felt like I came up, I was killing it for the 2 weeks that I was a Blue Jay that year. And we were playing at home in front of the hometown crowd. I had all the boys up for a big barbecue. And then I'm out there in left field. I think it was the 7th inning. And all of a sudden, John Farrell's waving me off the field. And I run in, I get handed the phone, and it's Alex letting me know I got traded to the Pittsburgh Pirates. And funny enough, it was my sister's birthday, and we had dinner plans after the game. So we all go to dinner, and it's super awkward, right? Because we're supposed to be celebrating my sister, but everybody at the table's got 100 questions for me. I'm like, I don't know. Like, I've never been traded. I don't know what this is like. So we finish dinner. I go home. I'm packing up all my stuff. It's awkward. You go back in the clubhouse. Nobody's in there. You're kind of like, well, do I take all my Blue Jay stuff? Do I leave it? Like, part of me is angry at the organization, which I wrote a tweet that went viral on this, which I thought was pretty cool, just to give fans that perspective, because it's a frustrating experience for everybody involved when things don't work out the way we hoped. So going through that, I hopped on a plane the next morning at 6 a.m., flew to Chicago, and we had a game that night in Wrigley Field. And I remember walking in the clubhouse, and some of these guys ended up being my best friends in my career of baseball. Andrew McCutchen, Josh Harrison, Neil Walker, like great human beings, but you're in a new space. You're no longer the first round pick, the franchise guy, all these, things that I had bought into in my career with Toronto. And walking into that clubhouse, they were in first place at the time. So I was excited to be a part of a winner, but there was just so much unresolved drama from my experiences in Toronto. I think it was Shai Davide wrote a big 3-page, like the saga of Travis Snider. And it was like kind of therapeutic for me to talk through all that stuff, even though I think it was a bit of a distraction from what I needed to focus on there in Pittsburgh. But yeah, that transition of being traded it's not like all those memories of getting sent down or the organization, the way they handled things, the way I handled things, like that doesn't go away. And I think that was something I had to continue to process. And I'm grateful for Clint Hurdle, Neil Huntington, Jeff Bannister, the whole coaching staff and organization of Pittsburgh, because they really embraced me, even though I was struggling mentally through a lot of my career there. They kept giving me opportunities. I ended up having a pretty nasty toe injury at the end of 2012 that I didn't really understand, was turf toe. Played through it in 2013. I posted a picture on Twitter, which was pretty disgusting. I guess I should have used the caution the caution tape before you open it, because it's like braided stitches, and I got a plate and 4 screws in my left foot. They took a bone out, cleaned out a bunch of bone spurs,
Whoa.
which from hitting, like that's your back foot, right? And you got to be able to hold your weight and control your load forward, and that was something I was struggling with, right, mechanically, throughout the few years that I was dealing with the pain of it. Even before that, it was kind of a tendency in my swing where I started jumping at the ball instead of staying in my legs. So I was really grinding at that point when I got to Pittsburgh. But what I learned in Pittsburgh was how to be a great teammate and how to buy into something bigger than yourself. And because there were so many, high prospect guys, because they got a lot of high draft picks, but then they bring in guys like me, all the former, I always joke on MLB trade rumors, you see all the former first round picks would end up getting picked up by Pittsburgh, right? Because they're trying to take a shot on somebody who they know has a high ceiling, but maybe has struggled and needs a change of scenery. So for me, it didn't just happen instantaneously where I just figured it out because I was no longer in Toronto. I was no longer, dealing with the stuff. I was still processing all that. But again, one of my favorite stories was I was the opening day starter in 2013, ended up being just a pinch hitter, bench guy, got left off the NLDS roster, but got to play in the wild card game. Had to kind of step back and watch them trade for guys to come in and fill my position and just find ways to be a great teammate to those guys. Even though they took my job, I didn't earn that position, right? And what they really bred as a culture in Pittsburgh was understanding how to buy into that team concept and how to make it bigger than yourself. And I struggled, right? And that's where Clint and I became really good friends, and Jeff Bannister, because they knew how much I cared and they knew how emotionally attached I was to the whole experience. So I was grateful to have those mentors, the great hitting coaches, Jay Bell, Jeff Branson, all those guys that did the best they could to kind of insulate me and make me feel a part of it. Like I said, great teammates there. My wife and I, lifelong friends from our experiences, and got to go to a city that wasn't quite as big, similar fan base, a lot of frustration from years of losing, and you want to go out there and produce. And we ended up collapsing in 2012, but the leadership amongst the team, AJ Burnett, another former Blue Jay teammate of mine, was there. And we had some good veteran leaders that just said, we're not going to allow this external noise, even from the coaches or the front office. We're going to control our clubhouse. And it was a really cool experience, because not only was I an opening day starter, I was also the last guy on the bench. I also had to learn how to keep the guys who are in the lineup like feeling good, because that's part of the teammatemanship, right? Is like how if Kutch has a bad game, or I don't take credit for any of these guys' successes, but these are the intricacies throughout a season when you got a George Springer who's struggling. Who can approach George and like get him out of his own head? How can you find a way to help these superstars that you need out there on the field to help you win? So it became a much more selfless experience. Even though I had great friends in Toronto, great coaches, it was just part of my maturation process and the culture shift that I experienced there. And it led to the playoffs in 2013. And then in 2014 was the year I was an opening day starter, 25th man on the roster, struck out the former NL MVP Canadian great Joey Votto with a nasty changeup where I shook off the other Canadian great Russell Martin, and was pinch hitting my way. Like I was leading the league in pinch hits, I think in July, and Kutch got hurt. They had called up Polanco. I was playing, he was right field at the time every day. Polanco struggled a little bit. Kutch came back, and I got to play every day down the stretch. And I told this story on another podcast. I'll tell you guys. Clint Hurdle and I had an interesting exchange, because we had a great bench, and a lot of us played, roles instead of just everyday players. We took a lot of pride in working out, doing speed and agility stuff, just staying ready and pushing each other to be ready to go when our name was called. And it's one of the coolest experiences I had of seeing not only the starters, but the bench guys that were just bought into pushing each other to be great. And when that opportunity came, I was playing mostly against righties, but I had better numbers against lefties than I did righties. So at one point, they went to pinch hit for me against a left-handed pitcher. I think I was hitting over 340 at the time, but I swallowed my pride, walked back to the dugout, rooted my teammate on, and they decided to put on a double steal, which took the bat out of the hands of the guy that they had just pinch hit for me. And I looked over at Clint and I looked over at Jeff and I said, "Are you effing kidding me? You pinch hit for me so you could try and pull that." And you don't even give him a chance to swing the bat. And there were some choice words used. And Banny, the bench coach, looks at me and said, "Get up the tunnel." So I go up there and I'm stomping up to my locker, and I put my cleats on or put my flats on, and I'm sitting there. Come back down. I'm like, okay. I walk right up to Clint. I walk right up to Jeff. I'm like, "I apologize. That got out of hand. That was unprofessional." And then, Skip looks at me and goes, "Hey, I loved it. The delivery was horseshit, but I love the passion. I love you really care about this." So, I mean, that was a special bond that I had with that coaching staff. I played every day the rest of the season, lefty or righty. I got to start against Madison Bumgarner, one of the best left-handed pitchers in that wild card game. And even though he buzzsawed us and we had no shot, again, it was a great experience of pride for me and grit of having to grind through the ups and downs of that season and then work my way back into the order and be a part of that wild card roster. It was really special.
Yeah, Baumgartner buzzsawed everybody back then, especially in the playoffs. He was unreal.
Yeah. Every other year, it was like, good luck, you got no shot.
Yeah, pretty much. I have a very close tie to Pittsburgh. It's probably my favorite city, I'd say, in the world. I actually have a book coming out in the fall that's set in Pittsburgh, and my last book was also set in Pittsburgh. So I don't know, something special about that town. We've had a few guests on from Pittsburgh as well. How did you like the city living in Pittsburgh?
So the city, when I got there, was just starting its kind of transformation, and I can't speak because I haven't been there in probably 10 years now, but when I was there, the downtown was kind of being rebuilt, and there was a lot of young professionals. So it went from being more of just the blue collar working class city, which it still is, and what makes it great. But the downtown really started to get kind of cleaned up. Nicer restaurants were going in. So for us, we lived in the city, which is different than living in the city of Pittsburgh, right? Or in Toronto, because Toronto, you're just like, you walk out of your thing at 10 o'clock at night and there's just a buzz and there's people all over the place. And it's tough not to gravitate towards that as a young single man. So being in Pittsburgh, it was a lot of fun to experience the city and watch it kind of evolve from where it was to not only in the city, but the fan base, right? Because they had really experienced a lot of hardship and did not have a lot of trust in the organization, rightfully so, because they had really just had to eat it. And then when we were able to break through, I actually talked to a guy who was at that wild card game. Probably the first time I ever talked to a fan who was at the wild card game. And it was like, every time I bring this up, I get chills because the electricity in that stadium was like, I played in and been in the bench or played in some other playoff games. And this was just second to none. And that's even including Seahawks, NFC championships where I've seen just the craziest stuff happen. So being a part of that was really cool. The fan base kind of repairing a little bit that relationship. I know they're kind of back to a strained place now, but just being a part of that, I think for so many people, whether there were kids or teenagers or adults, very few of them had seen a winning team in 25 years. So a lot of people remember that. And I think for us to be able to bring that to that city, it's just something I'll treasure for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I remember that game. It was wild.
Travis, since retiring, you pivoted to focusing on mental health initiatives for youth. My kids are in, a few sports that they enjoy. We don't put a ton of pressure on them. They kind of do what they want to do. I have some friends though that put a ton of pressure on their kids. They seem to be in like 3-4 sports. They're coaching their kids. Why do you think parents do that? Like what drives that do you think it's pressure from their youth that they're just kind of channeling back through to their own kids, or what do you think that is? What's that driver?
I think there's a couple of categories that we could talk about. I would start with the obvious, the crazy parent that everybody can identify at the game that's yelling and getting pissed off all the time. My question is, why is your emotional attachment that strong? Could have been you didn't make it to where you thought you could get. Could have been that your parents never pushed you and you wanted to push your kids. Could have been that your parents pushed you too hard. So maybe you take the different approach, right? Not push as hard. Again, I think a lot of it stems from past experiences. I think the world of youth sports has become corporatized, if that's even a word, where large organizations have found the ability to not only create the competitive pressure environment at a younger age outside of just the Little League baseball experience, right? Which even the Little League World Series, I always ask people, how many of these kids actually go on to play high school or college baseball because they experience that success so young. It's very difficult when they eventually fail and they're known as the Little League World Series kid every time they step on the field. But as the world of travel baseball and competitive tournaments, you have more organizations that are providing things like team state rankings, player rankings, and parents. It's a difficult thing, right? When you see your kids have success or failure at something, to manage the emotions that come with that being their parent. And if you hadn't experienced that kind of success and like me, made a lot of mistakes and saw kind of the underbelly of the world of just being great at something and how that affects the identity, I think that's what gets overlooked a lot of times for where kids are at in their developmental processes. So as the parents that I see, there's definitely some who are trying to live vicariously through their kids, whether that's consciously or subconsciously. You have parents who have the fear of missing out. And I think that's something organizations have really leveraged is telling parents that if their kids don't start playing baseball, for example, year round at 8, 9 years old, that they're not going to make their varsity baseball team. Not having a lot of great options, and every city's different, right? Some Little League programs are really difficult in terms of just the overall buy-in and just kind of the experience. But again, I remind parents, like, what age are we talking about? 5 to 7, 7 to 9, 9 to 12? Like, there's different developmental stages that these kids are in, but we've just pushed that competition, that pressure onto the younger phase. And that's where parents feel like if they don't have their kids doing those things, that they're not an adequate parent, that they're not providing all the opportunities for their kids. So again, I don't want all this to be shame and blame of parents. I think the way the system is designed and has evolved, it's made it very difficult for parents to differentiate their own emotional attachment to what their kids experiencing in sports and what your brain, because we're all guilty of it. If you have kids, you're like, okay, what is my son or daughter going to be when they grow up? And oh, he really likes baseball. We want to give him all the opportunities. So I think all parents are doing the best they can with the resources that they have. And that's where we really saw that gap to, I purchased the IP for this parent guidebook, and now I've created a business around it with my partner, Seth. Understanding that parents are the main driver in all this because they pay for it. They're the ones that are sacrificing the time, the energy it takes to take your kids all over the place. And with that becomes an extra layer of pressure for the kids because it's almost like this is an investment in your child's ability to go and play Division I sports or get a scholarship because maybe your family can't afford it. And it just starts becoming a narrative at too young of an age. And I don't blame parents because I see how easy it is to get sucked into that. And I still feel that as a parent when I see either my kid struggling or having success, or, you know, maybe some of his friends are going to go play on a more competitive team. What I've learned through this process is while my oldest is 7 years old, we had a really intentional conversation about what basketball team he wanted to play on. And he shared with me some feelings that I never would have known if I wouldn't have had like this training to actually ask him. And instead of going and playing on the more competitive team, which I kind of assumed would be the right choice, he had told me his experience with that team the year before. The coach, who I think is a fantastic guy and by no means crossed any lines that I saw as obvious, he was a little bit more of a firm, loud type of coach. And my son's like, I don't really like that style of coaching. I think I'd rather just play with another one of my buddies. And it led to him being able to go out. He put in a lot of work because he struggled a little bit his first year, and then put in a bunch of work and had a chance to play in a different culture, in a different environment. And he really thrived. And I think, again, when you see kids have success, you're trying to always balance the teeter-totter or the seesaw of success and failure with your kids, and not let them get built up on the success, but also not let the failure crush them. And I think that's where the idea of failure, winning and losing, and how now every parent feels like their kid has to play against the best all the time. They have to play 60, 70, 80 baseball games a year to develop, which we can argue back and forth about that. But we're physically exhausting and overusing our children at way too young of an age. And I'm somebody speaking from a place of elbow surgery at 15 because I was overused and pitched and caught in all these games in the league. And this wasn't even the 60, 70 game schedule these kids are playing now. So it's hard for me to kind of just sit back and watch some of the things that have evolved into the space, but I also know I can't come in here and just change all of them. But the idea is that creating that awareness with parents, not only from their own emotional, mental experience of being a parent in youth sports, but touching on some of the physical developmental things that you're setting your kid up for failure, right? And just overuse and burnout, right? Which is something that we see a lot of kids that have early success. They get burnt out, or they have a bad experience with a coach in a sport, and that leads to them never wanting to play the sport again. I think a lot of time parents feel like they have to just keep pushing, where there's a line, and I think every parent understands. You want to help your kid push through that adversity, and you want them to understand that, yeah, it might be scary, but you've done this before and it felt scary and you went out and had a really good time. So there's a balance there. But I think the primal instinct for me is just to push them out there and let them experience it. And I've just had to scale that way back. Also understanding playing baseball at the highest level and studying peak performance and being around high performers. There's a lot of wisdom that I want to impart into my children, but I'm their dad. I'm not their coach, right? And I think that's another thing that's tough for parents. Whether you don't have any experience, or you're successful in something, or you're not, you're just average person, right? I don't look at myself as above average just because I experience these things. I thought for a long time that I was above average, but then the humility of being a human will punch you right in the mouth. So I think there's a lot of parents out there that aren't doing it for the wrong reasons, but it's easy to get pulled into the pressure-packed environment of youth sports. And that's why the guidebook really resonated with me, because not a lot of parents think to take their kid to an ice cream parlor with a nice 7 to 10 questions to ask them and just be quiet and say, how do you feel about playing this sport? How do you feel about the team that you're on? Similar to what I did with my son in basketball, right? Which, again, I'm not trying to just pat myself on the back, but it was like, wow, it could have easily gone the other direction if I just wouldn't have asked a few questions, and him feel safe enough to be able to talk to me about this stuff. So that's one of the exercises that we have in the book, is an intentional conversation with your kid. We title Listening with the Heart. And that just allows you to ask them a series of questions and really understand, how do you feel when mom or dad cheers from the stands during the game, right? Because that's not every kid likes that, you know what I mean? And coaching from the stands even more so. Most kids don't like that. And then you have the car ride home, which is something we're going to dive a lot more into with our content, because for the first couple of years of my son doing sports, I wanted to get into the car and correct his mistakes, whether it's taekwondo or soccer or baseball. I wanted to be able to coach him up. I wanted to be able to teach him these things, instead of understanding I just need to ask how he's doing. And more often than not, he'll talk about the things that he wants to talk about. But if I want to sit there and lecture him and coach him, it's like I point this out to parents. If you listen to Tiger Woods talk about giving Charlie Woods swing advice, Charlie Woods won't take any swing advice. And his dad was the greatest golfer, arguably, of our generation for sure, but one of the greatest of all time. That's the parent-child dynamic that gets overlooked when we really want to overcoach our kids or put that pressure on them. So again, not shaming or blaming parents. I think a lot of this is just the way the system's designed, what's been normalized in youth sports. And again, that's where we're really trying to kind of pull back some of these curtains and get parents thinking from a different place of, okay, if my son doesn't play 8U hockey, I can't speak as much on hockey because I got zero experience there, but I know there's a lot of kids whose parents go into thinking I have to start them there to get them there. When it's like, how about we just start them there with the understanding we want to maintain the love for the game 16, 17, 18 years old. And when they reach, high school, if they're really passionate about something, they want to get serious and they want to work hard at it and they want to achieve things, great, we can do that. Before then, if your kid really loves something, take them to the park, take them to the basketball court, take them, in the backyard, and find a way to gamify whatever it is you're playing. Because that's another thing I see a lot of parents try and do is, and I'm guilty of this as well, I want to give my kids technical instructions, how to swing a bat, how to throw a baseball. And it's very easy for me, right? Because this is like second nature to coach a kid, but my kids don't receive that message the same way I can walk into a cage in a camp and coach a kid up. Even still, as coaches, we have to be more aware of like what the emotional state is of the kid that we're coaching so that we can meet them where they're at, right? You can't just coach everybody from the same place. But with my kids, I really try and let them guide the experience. And I have one son who just wants to play catch and wants to play baseball all the time. Do I think he's going to be a professional baseball person? I have no idea, right? And I don't want to even get down that road, even though my ego will start to go there and I'll have to observe it and kind of bring it back and say, hey, he loves this sport. When he asks me to play catch, I got to find a way to play catch with him. If he wants to, my other son will jump in and do that. He's a little bit more passionate about basketball and try and find ways to be out there playing basketball with him without saying, okay, we're going to do 20 jump shot. And I've had to pull back a few times where I'm like, I can give you all the structure to help you become great at something, but they're not ready for that. You know what I mean? And you can find ways to get them repetitions by making it fun and letting them lead. And you can get them to take 20 or 30 jump shots every time you're out there. You get them to take 20 or 30 swings and they don't realize it because you're not saying, okay, you got to put your hands here and we're going to hit 10 line drives. There's a point in time where coaches can enter that space and give the structure, but with the ages my kids are at, I really try and be careful about overstructuring things or trying to coach them. And that leads me to a place where then at some point I can be like, hey, can I tell you a little secret? Right? They're like, what? And then you drop a little knowledge on them. You see how it's received. And sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't. But it's a hard thing for a parent when you try and give your kid advice and they don't want it. And I think that triggers something inside of all of us where it's like, well, I know what's best for them, right? I've gone through this, or I was a professional at what I'm doing, without understanding what are you robbing them, right, from their childhood development of being able to push through things and figure things out on their own without mom and dad having to fix it all the time for them.
So much of what you're saying resonates.
Yeah. I think we all do it, right? And like, yeah, I think we also underestimate. You said you were talking about your kid and him coming up with his own ideas of what he likes for a coach, and that we underestimate what our kids can come up with on their own, for sure. And I think when you were also talking, I just want to touch on when you're talking about burnout. Not only is it burnout on the kids, but these parents I was talking about, they seem like they're run ragged. Like they look like they've got enough burnout from it that's probably passing on to their kids as well. So
yeah, and I don't want to demonize parents who are all in on the sports experience. It's just, let's travel the beaten path at a higher level instead of just operating from our own thoughts and beliefs. Let's start to challenge some of these ideas without demonizing the idea of a parent who really enjoys watching their kid play sports. It's like, how do we put the bumpers up for them without robbing them of that ability to struggle and to fail when appropriate, right? And be able to be there with the understanding of your role and how you best support your child is not by coaching them. It's by being their parent and making sure, especially in their whole life, but really through these developmental phases of 0 to 10, 0 to 11, where it's become very competitive and very pressurized with the experience of playing sports. That brings that up in us. It feels like we have to push them, we have to coach them, when it's like, no, they have to have some guidance, but we're not going to be able to take the swing for them. We're not going to be able to put the work in for them. And as much as we want to instill that in them, they're not ready at that phase. If a kid loves it, like I was mentioning before, if my kid wants to play catch every day, that's a sign that he's really into it. But there's also the double-edged sword of, is he doing that to receive my love because he knows that I love baseball? And I think that's always the question parents should keep in the back of their mind, not to demonize the kid who wants to play sports and you want to go practice and play with them. Again, make it the play experience, make it fun, make it light, make it loose, so that your child continues to foster that love for the sport that they are showing that interest in, instead of like, let's just jam it down their throat when they're not ready.
Yeah, good call.
Yeah. To go back to some of what you were talking about, my father was my hockey coach for most of my hockey career. He at one point pulled me out of hockey. There was a lot of reasons. Mostly it was drama with the town I played in. But one of his big reasons too was when you were talking about physical health. So I was 15 when he pulled, I guess I was almost 15 when he pulled me out. But I'd have been a goaltender up to that point. I was getting pretty beat up, had a few concussions. I also was a catcher in baseball. And my dad was just like, you physically can't keep doing this year after year, or you're going to run into some problems. He kind of knew. And lo and behold, I just had hip surgery. I have to have another one later this year. So he's right. One of the things going through it, and this is actually something you've talked about on your Twitter, is I can remember my dad saying, look, I'm talking to you as your dad. I'm not talking to you as your coach at this point. And he did a really good job of deciphering between the two. So we would have our talks in the car on the way home, and he was being my father, and we would have our talks at the rink, and he was always being my coach. What do you think the challenge is there for parents? Because there are parents who do coach, they go volunteer to coach. What's the biggest challenge for those parents?
Well, I'm one of them, right? And speaking of what your dad, the way he handled it with you, I think boundaries are important, right? And having the thoughtful conversation with your kid to know when you can coach them if you are in that role. I try and lean on my assistant coaches, which I'm lucky because I have another former major league guy who was coaching with me this year who knows my son very well, and another dad who played Division I baseball. From a baseball IQ standpoint, we're probably leading all of Little League, right, in baseball knowledge. But it's understanding how we can help each other's kids in those situations. So when the time presents itself, I'm not always the person that's trying to coach him up, right? And I think The biggest challenge I have is managing my emotions. I don't get upset if my kid doesn't get a hit and maybe struggles with something skill development wise. For me, it's more of when you see the sportsmanship and the things that you want to instill in them as far as being respectful. When those things start to kind of get breached, that's where I get triggered. And I had a moment with my child this year where I had to kind of sit him down at the end of the game because there was some chirping going on back and forth. And this is 7-year-old coach pitch baseball. And my immediate thing is like, okay, what have I done wrong here? How do I mitigate this with my child? Not understanding that this is what 7-year-old kids do, especially when they're out at school. I volunteer as school during recess. So I get to see and bring back the old experiences of playing soccer and how ruthless we were as kids, and how I can impact all those kids when I'm out there on the field, kind of helping them manage the emotions. It's really understanding what you're dealing with, right? If it's a 7-year-old kid, they're going to have those moments. And I made that mistake of wanting to coach him in the dugout and was upset with him in the car. And my younger son was in the car at the time, and I could tell they were both scared, right? Because they knew dad was mad. And then I had to go back and repair that with him and say, listen, dude, the first game of the season, your sportsmanship was so great. We had parents coming over and like complimenting how well you and your teammates were that game. You got this in you, right? But when we get overly competitive with the other team, and again, the other kids are doing stuff, right? And he gets triggered, and he's learning what getting triggered means, and like learning how to kind of process or understand when you're upset. He's not at an age where he can really regulate, but that's our job, right? Is to teach him how to regulate the emotions. I think for parents in sports and coaches who coach their kids in sports, how are you regulating your emotions? That's a perfect example of me not setting the example of saying, okay, bud, we're gonna sit out the rest of this game. We're gonna pack up our stuff. I love you, and we're gonna get in the car and we're gonna go home. We're gonna eat dinner, right? And that at some point the next day, or maybe before the next game, we'll have a conversation about it. But it can't be a lecture, because a 7-year-old, he's just like, Dad, I'm out. I don't want to listen to you talk for 10 minutes, and I can ramble, as you guys have witnessed. So having the understanding that we have to model that behavior that we're really trying to instill in our kids. And that's tough, right? It's easier said than done, but I think that's the greatest challenge and the greatest reward of parenting. And being able to support your kid through the tough games, that's pretty easy for me because I had a lot of bad games, and I have to remind my kids that while I did play professional baseball, I've struck out thousands of times in my life. And again, they're not quite at the stage where it's really going to sit and hit home, but how we regulate our emotions is huge. And I think any parent who's in that space, if you can have other coaches on the team that can help with maybe some of more of the technical stuff, and really just try and be out there and show not only your kids that you're coaching, but the other coaches, like lead from the front in terms of how you manage those situations. Because there's going to be a moment where the 7-year-old gets called out and he doesn't think he's out, and he's clearly out, and it's an emotional trigger for him, right? And I think that's always again, our kids have to experience those things and learn how to process it. But if it's happening, on a field in front of 30 or 40 parents, understand there's a pressure there that every kid feels to go out there and not have to hit off the tee or hit a ball and get out. And like that feels like this massive failure, like a love lost on some level, right, for kids. And that's kind of what I experienced in that panic attack experience when I was 11 years old. Is like, oh, everybody loves me for being the great player. Now I'm not the great player, so why do people love me? And I think going back to my son is like, I have to be better in those situations where there is a teaching moment, and we're not going to allow kids to just be disrespectful to the other coaches or the other team. But there's also kids on the other team that are going through this developmental process, and let's not make it more serious than it is. But let's get the points hammered home at the right time, instead of trying to do it in the moment when you're emotionally unable to regulate.
Travis, we really appreciate you coming on today. When people tune into this episode, what do you think they're going to take from it?
Humanizing the experience of sports. Because again, when people are really good at something, you become a public figure, you get all these followers, you get all these likes, you got, I look at guys like LeBron James that have been in the spotlight the entire time. And I don't know if anybody could have handled it better than he's handled it up until this point. I know there's maybe some stuff with his son being on the Lakers that people would want to debate about, but for me, it's not easy, right? Like, especially when you have this pressure and this spotlight on you. So understanding with your kids, whether they're failing or succeeding, right? These are all great life lessons for them, but don't build them up based off their successes or their failures. Understand that we're creating that foundation of resilience, because you have to learn how to deal with failure, but you also have to learn how to deal with the success. And not that every kid's going to make it to the major leagues when they're 20 years old, but They might make their varsity team as a freshman or a sophomore. They might, some kind of experience that kind of puts them ahead of the curve, right, from a developmental standpoint. The same way you have to manage your emotions when they're behind the curve, you also have to manage them when you're in front. And I think life learning, you know what I mean, is a huge thing that I try and preach to people, because I will never be perfect, but I will not stop trying to learn and get better.
That's awesome. Yeah, we've talked about that on this show, that the greatest teachers for us were mistakes and things that humbled us and all that sort of thing. So
right. And with that said, if you don't give your kids a chance to make those mistakes and experience those things and process it, you're there to guide them, but you can't solve every issue for your kid. And you also don't want to throw them into the fire, which is happening a lot in youth sports, before they're emotionally capable of handling it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that, as you're like, my oldest is 7 as well, so I'm learning that. My wife's learning that. It's something, it's tough to learn. It's definitely a very delicate balancing act to figure out.
Yeah, but let's all point out the elephant in the room, that parenting's really hard and that nobody's perfect, and we shouldn't judge and shame each other. But we can, if we can collect, well, we do have a book, and that's kind of the premise behind it. Yeah, but it's like, if we collectively can all get 10% better, whether it's reading our book or listening to a podcast and actually starting to lean into some of these things that we just assume are the way to do it. And that's, Russell Martin talked about the book, and he was just like, just realized maybe just the way my dad did it wasn't always the right way. That doesn't mean his dad was a bad person. My parents had their struggles, but there was a deep love and affection and a lot of good things that they passed down to me. But it's also understanding the generational cycles that are at play for every person. And if you're not aware of these things, you're not working to get better at them. A lot of times that's where you get stuck and you start going backwards.
Yeah, for sure. Well, you mentioned the book. You want to go ahead and plug your stuff?
Yeah. So www.3athletics.com. The company name is 3A Athletics, but we're 3athletics.com. We got our parent guidebook, Hero, again, helps parents understand what they're bringing in the relationship, how to have intentional, heartfelt conversations to develop that trust with their kid, how to deal with coaches, because that's another thing we didn't talk a lot about, but coaches are burnt out, a lot of parent drama. I mean, collectively, if we want this youth sports experience to be what it is, we as the parents have to be willing to do that work. And again, it's an 85-page workbook with a lot of space to write and exercises for parents to go through. It's not just some huge textbook on all the psychology of parenting. So it's something I've seen some massive transformations or realizations for parents that are really like, okay, I knew I was a good parent, but I was missing some things. Or like, hey, I've really struggled as a parent, especially in the sports space. So I think everybody can benefit from reading that. That's something that we're working on with local organizations and hopefully some north of the border, where they're going to bring us in. We'll provide the products. We'll also run the parents, the kids, and the coaches through some training and understanding of how this book can be effective for your relationship with your child. And we have an athlete's journal, which I helped Seth, we collaborated on, which is a 6-month with 6 monthly teachings, which is identity, subconscious and conscious mind, mindset, triggers, your parent relationship, and your coaches. And that's designed for kids 13 to 18. Less about just the mental skills of being great at a sport, but really diving into that identity of who you are and how you define yourself to people. Because as you guys remember, man, going through that middle school, high school experience is ruthless. And I was lucky to be the big sports star, so it made a lot of things a little bit easier. But it's tough for kids to really figure out when people are asking, what do you want to be when you grow up? You don't know what you want to be. I did, right? And some people do, but there's a lot of that pressure that gets put on the kids. And I think the journal is a great tool for every kid that's going through the sports experience to go through, because we can all relate to those topics. And it's 4 weeks of journal entries with prompted questions. So a really cool experience for the kids.
Yeah, that's awesome. I skipped school, so I didn't have any of that.
Yeah, it's all right.
Corey probably did that.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. Travis, I love your story. Thank you so much for being a guest on our show. We really appreciate it. And everybody listening, you can watch on YouTube. You can listen on pretty much anywhere your podcasts are available. And again, Travis, thanks a lot.
Thank you guys for sharing your platform with me.